Hi. I relish the comments of random people. It's wonderful. So this is an article, parts of an article, excerpts from an article by a doctor, a medical doctor, who he'll explain wanted to do a medical analysis of the death of Jesus. So I'll read this to you. We'll get done when we can get done. The bell will ring when it rings. Actually, I'm going to open up the door because the band isn't playing. So Christ's crucifixion, and this is a sobering passage. Let it sink in. Let it sink in. The Passion of Christ from a Medical Point of View by C. Truman Davis. In this paper, I shall discuss some of the physical aspects of the passion or suffering of Christ. We shall follow him from Gethsemane through his trial, his scourging, his path along the Via Dolorosa, meaning the way of suffering, the street of suffering, to his last dying hours on the cross. I became interested in this about a year ago, well, it's a long time ago now, but when I read an account of the crucifixion in Jim Bishop's book, The Day Christ Died. I suddenly realized that I had taken the crucifixion more or less for granted all these years, that I had grown callous to its horror by a too easy familiarity with the grim details, and a too distant friendship with him. It finally occurred to me that as a physician, I didn't even know the actual immediate cause of death. The gospel writers don't help us very much on this point because crucifixion and scourging were so common during their lifetime that they undoubtedly considered a detailed description totally superfluous and unnecessary. Everybody knew about it. So we have to have the concise words of the evangelists. Pilate, having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified, and they crucified him. I am indebted to many who have studied this subject in the past, and especially to a contemporary colleague, Dr. Pierre Barbet, a French surgeon who has done exhaustive historical and experimental research and has written extensively on the subject. The infinite psychic and spiritual suffering of the incarnate God of Jesus in atonement for the sins of fallen man, I have no competence to discuss. However, the physiological and anatomical aspects of our Lord's passion we can examine in some detail. What did the body of Jesus of Nazareth actually endure during those hours of torture? This led me first to a study of the practice of crucifixion itself, that is, the torture and execution of a person by fixation to a cross. Apparently, the first known practice of crucifixion was by the Persians. Alexander the Great and his generals brought it back from the Mediterranean world to Egypt and to Carthage. The Romans apparently learned the practice from the Carthaginians, and, as with almost everything the Romans did, rapidly developed a very high degree of efficiency and skill in carrying it out. A number of the Roman authors, Livy, Cicero, Tacitus, comment on it. Several innovations and modifications are described in the ancient literature. I'll mention only a few, which may have some bearing here. The upright portion of the cross, or the stipes, could have the cross arm, the patibulum, attached 2 or 3 feet below its top. This is what we commonly think of today as the classical form of the cross. Hi.
Logan?
Yes. The Latin cross. However, the common form used in our Lord's day was the tau cross, which is a T, shaped like the Greek letter tau, or a T. In this cross, the patibulum was placed in a notch above the top of the stipes. There is fairly overwhelming archaeological evidence that it was on this type of cross that Jesus was crucified. The upright post, or stipes, was generally permanently fixed in the ground at the site of the execution, and the condemned man was forced to carry the patibulum, the crossbar, approximately weighing about 110 pounds, from the prison to the place of execution. Without any historical or biblical proof, medieval and Renaissance painters have given us our picture of Christ carrying the entire cross. Many of these painters and most of the sculptors of crucifixes today show the nails through the palms. Roman historical accounts and experimental work have shown that the nails were driven between the small bones of the wrists and not through the palms. So the nail would have been nailed in right here on the wrists. Nails driven through the palms will strip out between the fingers when they support the weight of a human body. The misconception may have come about through the misunderstanding of Jesus' words to Thomas, "Observe my hands." Anatomists, both modern and ancient, have always considered the wrists as part of the hand. The titulus, or a small sign stating the victim's crime, was usually carried at the front of the procession to the cross, and later nailed to the cross above the head. This sign, with its staff nailed to the top of the cross, would have given it somewhat the characteristic form of the Latin cross. The physical passion of Christ begins in Gethsemane. Of the many aspects of this initial suffering, I shall only discuss the one of physiological interest, the bloody sweat. It is interesting that the physician of the group, St. Luke, is the only one to mention this. He says, "And being in agony, he, Jesus, prayed the longer, and his sweat became as drops of blood trickling down upon the ground." Every attempt imaginable has been used by modern scholars to explain away this phrase, apparently under the mistaken impression that this just doesn't happen. A great deal of effort could be saved by consulting the medical literature. Though very rare, the phenomenon of hematidrosis, or bloody sweat, is well documented. Under great emotional stress, tiny capillaries of the sweat glands can break, thus mixing blood with sweat. The process alone could have produced marked weakness and possible shock. We move rapidly through the betrayal and arrest. I must stress again that the important portions of the Passion story are missing. Important portions of the Passion story are missing from this account. This may be frustrating to you, but in order to adhere to our purpose of discussing only the purely physical aspects of the Passion, this is necessary. After the arrest in the middle of the night, Jesus was brought before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. It is here that the first physical trauma was inflicted. A soldier struck Jesus across the face for remaining silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him and mockingly taunted him to identify them as they passed by and spat on him and struck him in the face. In the early morning, Jesus, battered and bruised, dehydrated and exhausted from a sleepless night, is taken across Jerusalem to the praetorium of the fortress of Antonia, the seat of government for the procurator, the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. You are, of course, familiar with Pilate's action in attempting to pass responsibility to Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Judea. Jesus apparently suffered no physical mistreatment at the hands of Herod and was returned to Pilate. It was then, in response to the cries of the mob, that Pilate ordered Barabbas released and condemned Jesus to scourging and crucifixion. There is much disagreement among authorities about the scourging as a prelude to crucifixion. Most Roman writers from this period do not associate the two. Many scholars believe that Pilate originally ordered Jesus scourged as his full punishment, and that the death sentence by crucifixion came only in response to the taunt by the mob that the procurator was not properly defending Caesar against this pretender who claimed to be the king of the Jews. If you look just to the left there, this is a road, an ancient road. The road that Jesus took in Jerusalem to the cross is called the Via Dolorosa, the way or the street of suffering. And so above is excavated Roman pavement upon which some believe Jesus may have actually walked on his way to Golgotha. It is located numerous archaeological layers and 20 feet below the Via Dolorosa, so what is now called the Via Dolorosa, but as I've told you before, archaeological sites build on top of one another. And so 20 feet down, there's this very ancient road that's right under the Via Dolorosa. And it may be where Jesus walked. Preparations for the scourging are carried out. The prisoner is stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. It is doubtful whether the Romans made any attempt to follow the Jewish law in this matter of scourging. The Jews had an ancient law prohibiting more than 40 lashes. The Pharisees, always making sure the law was strictly kept, insisted that only 39 lashes be given. In case of a miscount, they were sure of remaining within the law. The Roman legionnaire steps forward with the flagrum or flagella in his hand. This is a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with 2 small balls of lead attached near the ends of each, and some of them had bits of jagged metal or bone or rock in them as well. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders, backs, and legs. At first, the heavy thongs cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into subcutaneous tissues, producing at first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial blood from the vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead first produce large, deep bruises, which are broken open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. When the centurion in charge determines the prisoner is near death, the beating finally stops. The picture above is called Gordon's Calvary. There was an archaeologist named Gordon, or a theologian, I'm not sure which, that saw that this looked something like a skull, and it was called the place of the skull. It is unlikely. There are a lot of people say that Gordon's Calvary is Calvary because a number of reasons of its having to do with its location. It probably isn't Calvary. We don't know for sure where Calvary is. The half-fainting Jesus is then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, wet with his own blood. The Roman soldiers see a great joke in this provincial Jew claiming to be a king. They throw a robe across his shoulders and place a stick in his hands for a scepter. They still need a crown to make their travesty complete. A small bundle of flexible branches covered with long thorns, commonly used for firewood, are plaited into the shape of a crown, and this is pressed into his scalp. If you look back, that blue canister back there, there are thorns. Mrs. Cook brought these back from Jerusalem and from Israel and gave them to me, and those are likely the type of thorns that were pushed into Jesus' scalp. Again, there is copious bleeding, the scalp being one of the most vascular areas of the body. After mocking him and striking him across the face, the soldiers take the stick from his hand and strike him across the head, driving the thorns deeper into his scalp. Finally, they tire of their sadistic sport, and the robe is torn from his back. This had already become adherent to the clots of blood and serum in his wounds, and its removal, just as careless as the careless removal of a surgical bandage, causes excruciating pain, almost as though he were being whipped, and the wounds again began to bleed. Again being whipped, and the wounds again begin to bleed. In deference to Jewish custom, the Romans return his garments. The heavy patibulum of the cross is tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the condemned Christ, 2 thieves, and the execution detail, headed by a centurion, begins its slow journey along the Via Dolorosa. In spite of his efforts to walk erect, the weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious blood loss, is too much. He stumbles and falls. The rough wood of the beam gouges into the lacerated skin and muscles of his shoulders. He tries to rise, but human muscles have been pushed beyond their endurance. The centurion, anxious to get on with the crucifixion, selects a stalwart North African onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. Jesus follows, still bleeding and sweating, the cold, clammy sweat of shock. The 650-yard journey from the Fortress Antonia to Golgotha is finally completed. The prisoner is again stripped of his clothes, except for a loincloth, which is allowed the Jews. The crucifixion begins. Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, a mild analgesic, meaning a mild painkiller mixture. He refuses to drink. Simon is ordered to place the patibulum on the ground, and Jesus is quickly thrown backward with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depression in the front of the wrist. He drives a heavy square wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to pull his arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. And the patibulum is lifted and placed at the top of the stipes, and the titulus reading Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is nailed into place. The left foot is pressed backward against the right foot, with both feet extended, toes down. A nail is driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim is now crucified. As he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails in the wrists, excruciating fiery pain shoots along the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrists are putting pressure on the median nerves. As he pushes himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he places full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, there is searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, another phenomenon occurs. As the arms fatigue, great waves of cramps sweep over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are paralyzed and the intercostal muscles are unable to act. Air can be drawn into the lungs but cannot be exhaled. Jesus fights to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he is able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in the life-giving oxygen. It was undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered the 7 short sentences. We'll pick up here on Monday.